Hello, everyone. I never forget the event in 15th August 2021. I was in Islamabad and watched a live TV. Taliban soldiers walked in the palace and made a statement. I was ordered a rescue mission from Command Center and started to count the number and to find exact locations of our personnel in Afghanistan. Most people prefer to grab the hopes in the other countries, rather than staying and rebuilding own country. Refugee is refugee mind. I am not humanitarian worker, and I still don't understand what they think. Anyway, it was a good and bad time for me. Today, we talk about refugee rights and responsibilities. Stay tuned, and as always, stay safe.
Okay, so we're diving deep into refugee rights and responsibilities, huh?
That's right, and you've given me a ton of stuff to work with here.
Articles, case studies.
We've even got some legal stuff.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to make this complex topic, well, less complex. Not just the what, but the why.
And the so what, right.
Exactly. Get ready for some aha moments, and of course, a little bit of deep dive humor along the way.
You always sneak that in.
Well, keeps things lively. But seriously, it's fascinating how history plays such a big role in how we handle these issues today.
It's true, we often focus on the numbers, but understanding the human side, the historical context, it's crucial.
Absolutely. And speaking of context, maybe we should start with some definitions,
Yeah, good idea. Make sure we're all on the same page. We're talking about refugees, but what does that even mean, really?
Right. It's not just anyone who leaves their country. There's a specific legal meaning. And that 1951 Refugee Convention you sent over.
Ah, yes. The cornerstone of international refugee law.
It defines a refugee as someone with a, and I'm quoting here, well-founded fear of persecution.
And that persecution has to be for a very specific reason: their race, religion, nationality.
Political opinion, or even being part of a certain social group. It can't just be because there's general violence or hardship.
Exactly. It's got to be targeted, you know what I mean?
Makes sense. But what about someone running from a war zone or a natural disaster? They're clearly in danger. Are they automatically considered refugees under this definition?
Well, not necessarily. While they might be protected under broader humanitarian principles, they might not fit that strict refugee definition in the 1951 convention.
So they might not get the same help or have the same rights?
Yeah, it can get pretty complicated.
Okay, I see. So let's say someone comes to a new country seeking safety, claims to be a refugee, but hasn't officially been recognized yet. What do we call that?
That's an asylum seeker. They're in limbo, kind of waiting to see what happens. They've applied for refugee status, but their claim hasn't been processed yet.
Must be nerve-wracking, not knowing if they'll be allowed to stay or sent back to a dangerous place.
It is. And that brings us to another important term: non-refoulement.
Non-what now?
Non-refoulement. It's a big deal in refugee law. Basically, countries can't send refugees or asylum seekers back to a place where they'd be in danger.
Seems pretty straightforward, but I imagine it gets tricky in practice.
Oh, absolutely. Think about your country with maybe limited resources.
Economic issues, security concerns.
And you're trying to balance all that with the need to help refugees. It's a tough situation.
It's like juggling chainsaws, isn't it? Speaking of which, how does Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, handle all of this? We have a history of providing refuge, but it's not always easy.
You're right. To understand where we are, we have to look back. The Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, that was a defining moment for the region. Think about it. Millions of people fleeing Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia.
Wow.
War, political upheaval. It was a huge exodus.
Yeah, I remember reading about Indonesia's role in helping the Vietnamese boat people. Really powerful example of humanitarian action.
It is. And then there's the ongoing situation with refugees from Myanmar. Temporary shelters set up in Thailand decades ago are still running today.
Really? Decades.
It shows how these crises can drag on, how temporary solutions sometimes become permanent.
Incredible. Makes you think. So how does this all connect with that 1951 Refugee Convention we talked about?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Despite all this, despite its humanitarian traditions, most Southeast Asian countries, including Indonesia, they haven't signed that convention.
Really? Why not?
It's complicated. Some say the convention, it's very rooted in a post-World War II European perspective.
Yep.
Doesn't quite fit with the realities of Southeast Asia.
So there are cultural and historical factors at play.
Definitely. And some countries worry about national sovereignty, the potential strain on resources.
Right, trying to balance their own interests with the needs of refugees. That's
Yeah.
a tough call.
Exactly. It's more than just that initial trauma of leaving, you know.
Right. Imagine that uncertainty.
The anxiety.
Not knowing where you belong or how you'll rebuild your life, it's a lot to deal with.
Absolutely. And then you've got the whole issue of climate-induced displacement, which just adds another layer of complexity to everything. We touched on how the 1951 convention doesn't really address this, right?
That's right. It's a pretty big gap in international law when you think about it. Millions of
Oh.
people being displaced by rising sea levels,
Droughts.
extreme weather events,
Yeah.
but they don't always fit that traditional definition of a refugee.
Right. It's not persecution in the classic sense, but it's forcing people from their homes all the same. So what happens to them? Do they have any legal protection?
That's the big question, and it's causing a lot of debate. Should there be a new legal category for climate refugees? Should we expand the existing frameworks to include those fleeing environmental disasters? There are strong arguments on both sides. I can see that. I mean, creating a new category would definitely give those displaced by climate change some much-needed recognition and protection. But then again, it could be a nightmare to actually define and implement. Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. How do you distinguish between someone who has to move because of, say, slowly rising sea levels versus someone fleeing a sudden earthquake?
Right.
And then there's the worry that expanding the definition of a refugee too much might weaken the protections for those fleeing traditional persecution.
It's a real dilemma.
Yeah.
So what are some of the solutions being talked about? What can we do to bridge this gap in protection?
Well, some countries are trying out new things like humanitarian visas or creating safe pathways.
Okay, I've heard of those.
This would allow people facing climate threats to apply for asylum before they have to make those dangerous journeys. It's
Yeah.
about giving them options, you know.
Right, so they don't have to risk their lives just to reach safety.
Exactly.
Sounds promising.
Then
What else is being done?
there's a growing realization that we need to put more effort into climate change adaptation and reducing disaster risk. If we can help communities become more resilient, well, it could mean fewer people needing to migrate in the first place. It's about tackling the root causes, you see.
I see. Helping communities stay in their homes, adapt to the changing environment, and thrive.
Yeah.
Now, what about technology? What role does that play in all of this?
Oh, technology is becoming increasingly important. Think about biometric identification systems, for instance.
Sure.
They can be used to register refugees, helps with aid distribution, keeps track of people. It can make things more efficient.
But that also raises some privacy and security issues, right? Especially when you're dealing with vulnerable people who might already be distrustful of authorities.
You're not wrong. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, that's for sure. And that's why it's so important to make sure any technology we use is ethical, you know?
Right.
Respects human rights, and puts the well-being of refugees first. It shouldn't be about spying on them or controlling them.
It should be about empowering and protecting them.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, I guess.
Speaking of balance, we keep coming back to this tension between national interests and humanitarian responsibilities.
We do, don't we?
It feels like that's at the core of so many of these challenges.
It's true. Countries, they have every right to control their borders, protect their citizens, but they also have a responsibility to uphold international law, offer refuge to those who need it. It's about finding that middle ground, I suppose.
And that's where this idea of burden sharing comes in, right? The idea that no one country should have to deal with a refugee crisis on their own.
That's the idea. International cooperation is key. It might involve financial aid to support host countries, maybe resettlement programs to distribute refugees more evenly, diplomatic efforts to address those root causes we were talking about. It really does take a village, you know?
Makes sense. It's a global problem. Needs a global solution.
Right. And it requires us to kind of shift our thinking a little bit. We need to move away from seeing refugees as just a burden and start seeing them as potential contributors.
Okay.
They bring skills, talents, fresh perspectives.
They can really enrich their new communities.
Exactly. It's about seeing the opportunity there.
So it's not just about charity. Investing in refugees can be good for everyone.
Precisely. And there are so many amazing stories of refugees who've overcome incredible challenges, built successful lives, and given back to their new homes. They become doctors, engineers, artists, they start businesses. They're out there enriching the fabric of their communities.
It's inspiring. But how do we change public perception? How do we get people to see beyond the headlines and recognize that we're all human?
I think it starts with education, challenging those negative narratives and promoting understanding. We need to dismantle stereotypes and encourage empathy, find that common ground, the things that connect us all.
Right, focus on what unites us, not divides us.
Exactly. We need to go beyond the statistics, the legalese. We need to tell those personal stories, the ones that really hit home.
Stories that make it real, make it relatable.
Right, because at the end of the day, this isn't just about laws and policies.
It's about being human.
It's about compassion, empathy, and doing the right thing.
Taking care of each other.
Realizing that anyone, anywhere, could become a refugee. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
It's about imagining yourself in their shoes, having to leave everything behind, your home, your life, your loved ones. It's about understanding that we're all connected.
Beautifully put. And in a world that's increasingly shaped by conflict, climate change, all these global challenges.
That empathy, that understanding, it's more important now than ever.
I agree. It's the foundation for building a better future for everyone, a future that's more just, more compassionate, more sustainable.
It's easy to get caught up in all the theory,
A loss in policies.
Right. But I think it's really important to bring it back to reality, to look at how this all plays out in the real world. What do you think?
Absolutely. Examining specific cases helps us grasp the human side of these issues.
Yeah.
It's about moving beyond the statistics and seeing the real people behind them, hearing their stories.
Exactly. So are there any case studies that you find particularly illuminating, ones that really highlight the complexities we're talking about?
Well, the Syrian refugee crisis is a prime example of just how massive displacement can be because of conflict.
Right.
Over 6 million people forced to flee their homes. Lives shattered by war. It's hard to even wrap your head around a number like that.
6 million. That's just staggering. And where have all those people gone? Have they found refuge in other countries?
Neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan,
Right.
they've taken on the bulk of this crisis, hosting millions of refugees. But it's put a huge strain on their resources, their infrastructure, even their social systems.
It's incredibly generous of them, but it must be incredibly difficult too. And it's not just about providing the basics like food and shelter. There's the mental and emotional toll as well.
Absolutely. The trauma of war, the grief of losing loved ones.
The uncertainty of the future.
All of that contributes to mental health challenges for many refugees. It's something that's often overlooked, but it's a crucial part of providing comprehensive support.
It's a reminder that we're talking about real people, real lives, not just numbers on a page. And then you have the Rohingya crisis, which is a stark example of what happens when people are persecuted and denied a nationality.
Yes, the Rohingya. Forced from their homes in Myanmar. So many have ended up in these overcrowded camps in Bangladesh, facing a really grim future.
It's a tragedy that's been going on for years. And it shows how urgent it is to find long-term solutions. It's not enough to just offer aid. We need to deal with the root causes.
You're right. The discrimination, the human rights violations, the political instability. It's about building peace and justice and sustainable development, tackling the underlying issues that force people to flee in the first place.
It's a long road, but it's the only way to prevent these crises from happening again and again. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe and secure in their own countries, where they have a chance to build a good life for themselves and their families. Speaking of building a better future, can we talk about something closer to home for a moment? I'm thinking of the Aceh tsunami in Indonesia back in 2004.
Yes. The Aceh tsunami. That was a stark reminder of the power of nature, a devastating event that displaced over 390,000 people.
It was a tragedy that deeply affected Indonesia, but it also showed the resilience of the Acehnese people and how effective both domestic and international aid efforts can be.
Exactly. The outpouring of support and solidarity after the tsunami was truly remarkable.
He was.
It showed what humanity is capable of when we come together in the face of adversity, but it also highlighted some weaknesses in our disaster preparedness and response systems.
I see. So what lessons were learned?
Well, it showed the importance of early warning systems, better infrastructure, and community-based disaster risk reduction strategies. And we can't forget the long-term environmental impact of an event like that. which can have a lasting effect on displaced people and the ecosystems they depend on.
It's a lot to consider. And it reminds us that displacement isn't always about conflict or persecution. Natural disasters can also uproot lives and communities. And as climate change gets worse, we're likely to see more and more of this type of displacement in Southeast Asia and around the world.
Sobering thought. And as we wrap up our deep dive, it's clear that there are no easy answers to these challenges. Each situation is different. Each context has its own nuances.
That's true. There's no magic bullet.
What we can learn from these real-world examples, though, from all these different experiences, is that empathy, compassion, and a commitment to human rights are absolutely essential. They're the foundation for any effective approach to refugee protection.
They're the guiding principles that can help us navigate these complex situations with sensitivity and understanding. It's been a really insightful conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. The more we learn, the more we understand, the better equipped we are to make a real difference in the lives of refugees and displaced people everywhere.
It's a call to action for all of us to stay informed, stay engaged, and advocate for policies and practices that uphold the dignity and rights of every human being. It's been an incredible journey exploring these complex issues with you. But now we turn it over to you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on everything we've discussed? How do you think climate change will impact migration in your own communities? And most importantly, how can each of us contribute to creating a more welcoming and inclusive world for refugees?
These are questions that deserve our attention, our careful thought, and our collective action. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.